The night I realized something was wrong, I was sitting 40 meters above the water, watching the crane cable drip seawater back into the dark like it was bleeding slowly. The platform lights were steady, the wind was calm, and the radio was quiet in that way that makes you check if it's still on. What bothered me wasn't the silence, but the way the shadows under the rig didn't line up with the steel above them anymore. I remember thinking I'd skipped dinner, and my hands were shaking because of that, not fear. Later, when they finally told me there were 11 strange rules you follow if you want to leave this place alive, I understood why no one corrected me sooner. Some realizations only work if you arrive at them alone. I didn't know that sentence existed until it was already too late to pretend the shadows were harmless, and the memory of hearing Rule 1, never assume the shadows below the platform belong to the rig or the sea, came back to me later like a delayed bruise. At the time, I was still telling myself the crane cab felt smaller because I'd been up there too long, not because something was pressing in from below. The chair creaked every time I shifted my weight, and I kept my boots planted like the floor might tilt if I relaxed. I remember thinking that if I stared down long enough, the ocean would correct itself and behave normally again. It didn't. From 40 meters up, the water usually looks predictable, even comforting in a harsh way, but that night it felt like a surface pretending to be calm. The lights under the platform cut through the dark in rigid cones, revealing the familiar tangle of pylons, braces, and ladders that disappeared into the black. I'd stared at that view for months without feeling anything beyond boredom and routine focus. This time, my eyes kept snagging on places where the shadows didn't quite match the steel above them. It wasn't dramatic movement, just subtle misalignment, like a reflection lagging half a second behind reality. I leaned forward in my seat and adjusted the crane angle, expecting the shadows to snap back into place once the perspective changed. Instead, they slid sideways, slow and deliberate, like something trying not to be noticed. My throat tightened, and I caught myself holding my breath, which annoyed me more than the fear did. Fear I could handle. It was the irritation at my own reaction that made my hands tremble. I told myself exhaustion does strange things to depth perception, especially at night, especially alone. The radio stayed quiet, but not dead, which somehow made it worse. Every few seconds, a faint hiss reminded me I wasn't cut off, just temporarily uninteresting to everyone else. I almost keyed the mic to ask if anyone else was seeing this, then stopped because I didn't want to be the guy who cried hallucination on a calm shift. Out here, reputation sticks longer than common sense. I swallowed and kept watching, forcing myself to catalog details the way I always did when things felt off. Count the pylons, trace the cables, follow the ladder rungs until they vanished. That was when one of the shadows broke the pattern completely. It didn't stretch or blur like the others. It folded in on itself, thickening instead of thinning as it moved away from the light. My brain tried to label it as overlapping structures, anything that fit within the rules of steel and water. I even smiled a little, convinced I'd figured it out, because relief makes you stupidly optimistic. The smile faded when the shadow separated cleanly from the pylon it should have been attached to. It hovered there, independent, patient. I shifted the crane controls again, not because I needed to move anything, but because doing something felt better than sitting still. The load hook swung gently, dripping water in a steady rhythm that marked time better than the clock on the console. With each drop, the shadow below seemed to inch closer to the platform, though nothing physical bridged the gap. I told myself perspective was playing tricks again, that depth is easy to misjudge in darkness. Still, I found myself pulling my feet back from the edge of the cab floor just in case. My supervisor's voice finally broke through the radio, casual and tired, asking if I was seeing anything unusual on my end. The way he phrased it made my skin prickle, because it sounded rehearsed, like a line he'd used before. I answered honestly, describing the shadows without adding my growing unease. There was a pause long enough for me to imagine him exchanging looks with someone else, even though he was probably alone too. When he spoke again, he told me to keep working and not to assume anything I couldn't verify. That word stuck with me, assume bouncing around my head as I stared down at the water. I realized how much of my job relied on assumptions layered so thick they felt like facts. The steel will hold, the cable won't snap. The shadows mean nothing. Questioning any one of those makes the rest wobble. I wondered how many people before me had noticed something similar and decided it was safer not to think about it. Out here, ignorance isn't just bliss, it's survival. The shadow closest to the platform shifted again, and this time I could swear it reacted to the crane's movement, not the other way around. When I nudged the controls left, it drifted right, maintaining a careful distance as if testing boundaries. I laughed softly inside the cab, the sound thin and unconvincing, and shook my head at myself. I'd seen stranger optical illusions during storms and heavy fog. This was just another story my brain was telling, because it didn't like being alone. I tried focusing on the checklist taped to the side panel, running through items I knew by heart: boom angle, wind speed, load stability, all green, all normal. The act grounded me for a moment, pulling my attention away from the water below. When I looked back down, the shadows had rearranged themselves into something that felt less accidental. They clustered closer together, overlapping in ways that didn't match any structure I knew. The sense of being watched crept up slowly, unwelcome but persistent. I told myself watching implies eyes, and eyes require bodies, and bodies don't exist where there's nothing but steel and salt water. That logic usually worked for me, but it faltered when the shadows began to thin near the edges, stretching upward like they were reaching. I stood up from the chair before I realized I'd decided to, my knees brushing the console as if the cab had shrunk another inch. My heart was beating hard enough that I felt it in my ears, a dull pressure that made concentrating difficult. Another radio call came through, this one from a deckhand asking if the crane was moving on its own. I looked down at the controls, surprised to see the indicator lights flickering faintly. My hands were off the levers, resting in my lap, fingers curled tight. I told him no. Everything was stable because admitting uncertainty felt more dangerous than lying. The idea that something below might be influencing the crane made my stomach twist in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. The shadows stopped moving after that, settling into a configuration that looked almost neat. I stayed standing, afraid to sit back down, afraid that relaxing would invite movement again. Minutes stretched, marked only by the slow drip from the cable and the occasional hiss of the radio. I started to believe the moment had passed, that whatever my eyes had been doing was over. That fragile sense of relief cracked when I noticed one shadow hadn't settled with the others. It lingered directly beneath my cab. I leaned forward despite myself, peering down until the edge of the platform cut into my view. The shadow didn't belong to any beam or ladder. It was too round, too deliberate in its stillness. I felt a sudden irrational urge to wave, to see if it would respond, and that scared me more than the shadow itself. The thought hadn't felt like mine, more like a suggestion that had slipped into my head unnoticed. I stepped back quickly, pressing my shoulders against the cab wall. The realization that something could influence my thoughts, even subtly, left me cold. I replayed the supervisor's words again, not to assume anything I couldn't verify, and understood then that the rule wasn't about dismissing fear. It was about not letting your mind fill in gaps with comforting lies. The shadows didn't need to be monsters to be dangerous, they just needed to exist outside my assumptions. Standing there, heart racing, I sensed that acknowledging that fact was the first step down a path I couldn't see the end of yet. The lights flickered once, barely noticeable, but enough to send the shadows rippling like disturbed water. My radio crackled as if someone was about to speak, then fell silent again. I stayed where I was, breathing shallow, waiting for the rig to feel solid under my feet again. It didn't, and the uncertainty settled in my chest, heavy and unmoving, as the night pressed on and the water below held its secrets just out of reach. The moment I decided to treat what I was seeing as real instead of fatigue, the memory of Rule 2. If a shadow moves before the structure above it does, stop the crane immediately, surfaced later with an unpleasant clarity that made my teeth ache. At the time, all I knew was that my sense of balance felt off, like the platform had shifted a few degrees without telling anyone. I stood there in the cab, hands hovering just above the controls, staring down at the water where the shadows had settled into that wrong, patient stillness. It felt like pausing in the middle of a sentence, unsure how it was supposed to end. I told myself to sit back down and finish the shift like a professional, because panic doesn't keep you employed, and imagination gets people transferred. The crane cab smelled faintly of oil and old coffee, familiar enough to be grounding, and I forced my breathing to slow until my hands stopped shaking. Below me, the rig was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from everyone doing exactly what they're supposed to do. That normalcy almost convinced me nothing had happened at all. Almost. The next lift came in over the radio, a routine repositioning of equipment from one side of the deck to the other. I acknowledged the call and eased back into the chair, telling myself movement would reset whatever feedback loop my brain was stuck in. The crane responded smoothly, the boom angling just enough to clear the railing. As the cable tightened and the load rose, I glanced down out of habit. That's when I saw it. The shadow beneath the platform slid sideways before the steel above it shifted. It wasn't dramatic or fast, just early, like someone stepping out of line a half second before their cue. My first thought was that I'd imagined the order of movement, that my eyes were lagging instead of the shadow. I blinked hard and watched again, heart starting to thud in my chest. The structure above followed, delayed but obedient, confirming what I'd seen. My instincts screamed at me to stop, but instinct and training don't always line up cleanly. Stopping the crane mid-lift triggers its own chain of protocols and questions, and I hesitated, fingers brushing the emergency control without pressing it. That hesitation stretched longer than it should have, filled with calculations about paperwork and explanations. The shadow below drifted a little farther, widening the gap between itself and the steel. It felt like a test I didn't remember agreeing to take. I keyed the radio and asked if anyone else was seeing movement under the platform, keeping my voice as even as I could. The reply came back too quickly, a deck supervisor telling me to focus on the lift and stop narrating the scenery. There was laughter in the background, friendly but dismissive, and I felt a flush of embarrassment that cut through the fear. I released the radio button and told myself that if I stopped the crane now, I'd look ridiculous. That thought still makes me angry. The load swayed slightly as the crane continued its arc, water dripping from the cable in that steady rhythm that had become unsettlingly comforting. I watched the shadows like a hawk, counting seconds between movement above and below. Each time, the shadow anticipated the steel by just enough to notice. My chest tightened with every confirmation, a sense of inevitability creeping in. I realized then that whatever was happening didn't care whether I believed in it or not. Finally, the gap widened enough that denial felt irresponsible. I hit the stop, harder than necessary, and the crane shuddered to a halt. The sudden stillness was jarring, like slamming on brakes you didn't know you'd been rolling on. The load hung there, suspended, and the shadow beneath froze as well, as if waiting to see what I'd do next. For a brief, foolish moment, I felt triumphant, like I'd won a small standoff. The radio exploded with voices demanding to know why the crane had stopped. I explained as calmly as I could that I'd seen irregular movement and needed a moment to verify conditions. The response was a sharp intake of breath from my supervisor, followed by a pause that stretched uncomfortably long. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, stripped of humor and irritation. He told me to keep the crane still and wait for further instruction. That was when I realized how isolated I actually was. The cab suddenly felt miles away from everyone else, a glass bubble suspended over something I didn't understand. Waiting is easy when you trust the people telling you to wait. It's agony when you're not sure they're being honest. I stared down at the shadow directly beneath me, now perfectly aligned with nothing at all. It seemed to thicken as the seconds passed, its edges growing less defined. My thoughts started to spiral, branching into unhelpful directions. I wondered how many operators before me had seen this and chosen to ignore it. How many times the crane had moved when it shouldn't have. The idea that the rig might be complicit in something, that the steel itself had learned bad habits, lodged in my mind and refused to leave. I shook my head, annoyed at myself for drifting into nonsense, but the unease stayed. A maintenance tech climbed partway up the ladder beneath the cab, his helmet light bobbing into view. He keyed his mic and asked what the problem was, sounding more curious than concerned. I told him to stop where he was and not look down into the water. The words came out sharper than I intended, and he hesitated, clearly debating whether to listen. For a second his light angled downward, and I felt my stomach drop. He froze, gripping the ladder, and I heard him swallow before he spoke again. He said the shadow under him didn't match his position, that it looked stretched, wrong. I told him to climb back up slowly, without taking his eyes off the ladder. He did, breathing fast, and when he reached the deck, I heard someone take his radio away. The channel went quiet after that, leaving me alone with my thoughts again. The shadow beneath the cab shifted subtly, responding to the absence of movement above it. It felt less like a reflection and more like a placeholder, something filling space until it was needed. I kept my hands firmly away from the controls, afraid that even a small adjustment would invite it to act first again. Sweat trickled down my back, despite the cool air in the cab, and I realized how tense my body had become. Time stretched in strange ways while I waited. Minutes felt like hours, then snapped back into something almost normal when my supervisor finally spoke. He told me to resume movement slowly and keep my eyes on the water. The instruction felt wrong, but authority carries weight, especially in environments built on hierarchy. I eased the controls forward, heart hammering, and watched. The shadow didn't move this time. The steel above it shifted first, dragging its dark twin along a fraction of a second later. Relief washed over me so strongly, it made me lightheaded. I continued the lift, finishing the task without further incident, though my hands never stopped shaking. When the load was secured and the crane at rest, I slumped back in the chair, exhausted in a way that felt deeper than physical. I spent the rest of the shift hyper-aware, flinching at every flicker of light and ripple of shadow. Nothing else happened, which somehow made it worse. Normalcy returned too quickly, smoothing over the edges of what I'd seen until it almost felt unreal. Almost. As dawn crept in and the water lightened, the shadows behaved themselves again, lining up neatly with the steel above, but the unease didn't fade with the daylight. It settled into me, heavy and unresolved, because I knew now that timing mattered more than appearance. Something down there wasn't content to follow, it wanted to lead. As I shut down the crane and prepared to climb down, I couldn't shake the feeling that stopping it once had only delayed whatever came next, and that the next rule would demand more than quick reactions and steady hands. I didn't learn that sentence from a briefing or a warning sign, but from the way my supervisor's voice changed when I asked if I could adjust the lights to get a clearer look, and later the exact wording of Rule 3, never point the crane light directly at a shadow that doesn't match your movement, came back to me with an uncomfortable precision. At that moment, all I felt was frustration mixed with embarrassment, because daylight had returned, and everything looked normal again, like the night had been some shared misunderstanding the rig was eager to forget. I hated how easily my fear had been invalidated by sunlight, how quickly I started doubting myself. That doubt made the next decision feel reasonable instead of reckless. Day shifts are louder, busier, filled with enough activity that you stop listening to your own thoughts. The ocean looks less like a void and more like a working surface, a place where things fall and get retrieved and forgotten. I climbed back into the crane cab after a short break, telling myself the worst thing exhaustion can do is make you see patterns where none exist. The shadows below the platform were back to behaving, neatly stitched to steel and ladder and cable. If anything, they looked boring, and boredom is comforting out there. I kept replaying the moment from the night before, though, the way one shadow had anticipated the crane's movement. It nagged at me like an unsolved problem, and I found myself wanting confirmation more than reassurance. The crane's spotlight was adjustable, meant to help with precision lifts and inspections when deck lighting wasn't enough. I hadn't used it often, but the control was right there, tempting in its simplicity. Light reveals things. That's what it's for, and the idea that it might also provoke something hadn't crossed my mind yet. The first few times I swept the light across the water, nothing happened. The beam cut cleanly through the surface, illuminating familiar shapes below. I told myself that if there had been something wrong, I would have seen it now, and that the night shift had just worn me down. The sense of control that came with operating the light soothed me, steadying my breathing. I almost laughed at myself for letting imagination get the better of me. Then the radio crackled, and my supervisor asked too casually why I'd turned the crane light on. I answered honestly, saying I was checking alignment and visibility. There was a pause, longer than necessary for processing that information, and when he responded, he told me to keep the light angled away from the water directly beneath the cab. He didn't explain why, and that omission bothered me more than a reprimand would have. Authority without explanation breeds curiosity, not compliance. I nudged the light slightly, testing boundaries the way you do when you're not sure where the real line is. The beam grazed the edge of the platform shadow, brightening the water just enough to sharpen its outline. For a second, everything stayed still, and I felt foolish again. Then the shadow reacted, not by retreating or shifting, but by darkening, as if absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. The water around it seemed to dim in response, a subtle change that made my eyes ache. My first instinct was to pull the light back, but curiosity held me in place. I told myself it was algae, or depth, or some trick of contrast I didn't fully understand. The shadow thickened further, its edges becoming more defined, less like absence and more like presence. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like I was staring at something too closely for too long. The sensation wasn't painful, just uncomfortable enough to make me aware of my own body again. I keyed the radio to ask if anyone else could see the light behaving strangely, but stopped when I realized how that would sound. Instead, I described the shadow, careful to keep my voice neutral. The response came back clipped and immediate, telling me to turn the light off and keep it pointed away from the water. There was no room for discussion in that tone, just urgency barely masked as professionalism. That should have been enough to make me listen. I hesitated again, just long enough for the shadow to do something I still have trouble explaining. It didn't move toward the light or away from it. It leaned, like a shape shifting its weight. The movement wasn't tied to any structure above, and it wasn't delayed or anticipatory. It was independent, intentional. My stomach dropped, and I felt a sudden overwhelming urge to apologize, though I had no idea to whom. I shut the light off abruptly, plunging the water back into its usual dimness. The shadow relaxed immediately, thinning and spreading until it looked almost normal again. My heart was pounding hard enough that I had to sit down, hands trembling as they rested on my knees. I realized then how badly I'd wanted proof, and how dangerous that desire was. Seeing something clearly isn't always the same as understanding it. The rest of the crew seemed on edge after that, though no one said anything directly to me. Conversation stopped when I walked into a room, and I caught people glancing at the crane cab like it was something volatile. During lunch, a deckhand mentioned offhandedly that lights can attract things you don't want attention from, then laughed it off when no one responded. The joke fell flat, hanging in the air longer than it should have. Back in the cab, I kept the crane light off, resisting the urge to test it again. Every time my eyes drifted downward, I half expected the shadows to react just to my attention. They didn't, and that restraint felt deliberate, like something waiting for the right condition to repeat itself. The ocean looked darker now, even under the sun, as if it remembered the light and didn't appreciate it. I thought about the maintenance tech from the night before, the way his voice had changed when he looked down. I wondered what he'd seen in the brief moment his helmet light had angled toward the water. The idea that light might reveal more than just shapes made me uneasy. Out here, tools are extensions of your body, and misusing them can have consequences you don't anticipate. As the shift wore on, my supervisor called me privately and asked if I'd learned my lesson. He didn't specify what lesson, and I didn't ask. I said yes because that seemed like the correct answer, and because I wasn't sure what would happen if I said no. There was a long silence on the line before he told me to stay alert and ended the call. The lack of reassurance bothered me more than a warning would have. Late in the afternoon, clouds rolled in, dulling the light and flattening the sea into a uniform gray. The shadows beneath the platform deepened accordingly, blending together in ways that made it harder to distinguish individual shapes. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on tasks that required precision and attention. Still, I felt the pull of what I'd seen earlier, a memory that refused to stay quiet. When the crane light flickered briefly due to a power fluctuation, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't turn on fully, just enough to send a weak beam downward for a fraction of a second. In that instant, I thought I saw the shadow tense again, like a muscle contracting in anticipation. The light died before I could be sure, leaving me with uncertainty gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. I climbed down from the cab carefully, avoiding looking straight down into the water as I descended. The platform felt solid under my boots, reassuring in its weight and noise. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd crossed some invisible line by trying to illuminate what preferred to stay unexamined. That night, lying in my bunk, I kept seeing that shadow darkening under the light, responding not with fear, but with interest. It made me question whether the rules were there to protect us, or to protect whatever lived below from us. The thought unsettled me deeply, because it suggested a balance I hadn't considered before. As sleep finally crept in, I had the distinct feeling that the shadows were aware of my curiosity now, and that the next mistake wouldn't be forgiven so quietly. I learned that lesson the hard way, in the sort of quiet that makes the ocean feel like a predator waiting to pounce. And only later did I recall Rule 4. Never leave the crane cab without locking all hatches, even if you think you're alone, as if it had been whispered into my mind after the fact. At the time, I was just thinking I'd step out for a quick break, stretch my legs, and shake off the tension from the last night shift. It seemed harmless, just a few seconds outside the cab, nothing touching the shadows below, nothing really watching. I remember fumbling with my gloves, feeling the metal controls beneath my palms, and imagining that the silence was simply the rig settling, normal and predictable. The ladder down to the platform was slick with seawater, and I realized halfway down that the cab door had a latch I hadn't engaged. My stomach sank, but I told myself it didn't matter. Who would climb 40 meters to get in here when the crew was busy with morning checks? It was the kind of rationalization I had used countless times on long shifts, convincing myself that what I didn't see wasn't real, that what I didn't account for didn't exist. But the shadows below had already started responding, elongating in ways I hadn't noticed from above, as if the absence of my containment had given them permission to stretch. I reached the platform and glanced up, half expecting to see the crane controls moving by themselves. Nothing happened, just the usual sway and hum of machinery, but I could feel it in the back of my neck, the same pressure I'd felt before when I'd ignored the first 2 rules. I thought about the maintenance tech from last week, the way he froze when his light brushed against something impossible in the water. I realized then that my minor oversight wasn't trivial. It was an invitation. A small lapse could grow into a problem I couldn't even name yet. The thought made my hands sweat despite the cool metal under my fingers. The hatch creaked slightly as I leaned against it, almost as if it were alive, testing the limits of its frame. My own breath sounded loud in the otherwise still morning, and I felt a shiver run through me, though the temperature hadn't changed. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, checking cables, observing the deck, ensuring the safety of the load. Yet every time I shifted my gaze, I caught a movement in the shadows below that wasn't tied to anything tangible above. They were thinner, more fluid, stretching across spaces they shouldn't have reached. A silent reminder that I wasn't as alone as I liked to think. My mind kept circling back to the cab, the simple act of locking a hatch that I had ignored. I pictured the latch snapping into place, a boundary that separated me from whatever lived in the darkness. It was absurd how much comfort that tiny lock could provide, yet its absence made me feel exposed, as if something could slide past the thresholds of metal and steel and reach me. I realized that rules like this weren't arbitrary. They were lessons encoded through observation, through near misses and forgotten warnings, accumulated over time until breaking one carried a price. I was only beginning to understand. I started my walk back toward the cab, intending to return and engage the lock properly. Every step felt measured, cautious, like moving through a space that might shift if I wasn't careful. The platform underfoot groaned and flexed in the tide, but it wasn't the rig that unsettled me. It was the sense that something moved in tandem below, tracking my progress. The shadows had reorganized themselves into patterns that mimicked the structure, a reflection of the rig's geometry, but wrong, slightly askew. I realized the shadows didn't just mirror reality, they anticipated it, and my absence had given them space to experiment. When I reached the cab, I paused before engaging the latch, watching the water below for any sign of movement that wasn't mine or the rig's. A faint ripple, too precise to be current, made me flinch. My hands hovered over the metal, unsure whether I should act quickly or slowly. The hesitation itself felt dangerous. I thought about the previous night's lesson, about shadows moving before steel, and how every delayed action could magnify consequences. I exhaled, forcing myself to engage the latch decisively, hearing the reassuring click that confirmed the boundary was back in place. Sitting back in the cab, I felt a fragile sense of control return, though it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering doubt. The shadows below returned to a state of stillness, though not the kind that promises safety. It was the calm of observation, of watching, waiting to see if the rules had been honored. I realized that each rule depended on compliance and awareness, not brute strength or skill, and that breaking even one could ripple into consequences that I might never fully comprehend. The lesson of the hatch was subtle but severe. Sometimes protection lies in the simplest gestures, and neglect can be invisible until it isn't. For the remainder of the shift, I stayed alert, performing routine checks and double-checking every control and cable. My mind refused to wander, replaying the moments I had underestimated the shadows and what the absence of a simple lock might have allowed. I became acutely aware of the thin line between safety and exposure, the delicate threshold that separated certainty from ambiguity. Every shadow, every angle of light on the water, carried significance now, each minor shift magnified through the lens of my own vigilance. By the time the sun began to set, I felt drained, not just physically, but mentally, weighed down by the awareness that rules were the difference between surviving and losing something fundamental. Even as I climbed down at the end of my shift, I kept glancing back at the cab, reassuring myself that every hatch was secure. The shadow patterns below remained static, obedient for the moment, but I knew the compliance was conditional. The knowledge that I had broken the rule, even briefly, lingered like a scar, reminding me that vigilance wasn't a choice, it was survival. The quiet of the ocean, the hum of machinery, the faint smell of seawater and metal, all combined into a sensory reminder that the shadows were patient, that they were waiting for mistakes. And I understood, more clearly than ever, that locking the hatch was never about securing a door, it was about securing the fragile boundary between order and whatever existed below. I only realized the gravity of Rule 5. Never signal to anyone on the platform while a shadow is directly beneath the cab. After I thought I could quietly warn a deckhand about what I'd seen. At first, it seemed harmless. A simple hand gesture, a small nod, a subtle movement to indicate watch out. I was convinced that if I stayed calm, the shadow below wouldn't notice, that my control over the crane, and my awareness of the structure above me would be enough. That confidence vanished the instant I lifted my hand, because the water beneath me seemed to ripple independently of wind or current, as if the shadow was responding to my intent before I even acted. My heart slammed in my chest, but curiosity and the need to communicate overpowered the rising dread. The cab felt smaller than usual, the confined space amplifying every heartbeat and every faint groan of metal. I remembered the deckhand's position, frozen mid-step, looking up at me, unaware of the subtle drama unfolding beneath our feet. The crane light was off, but the shadow had not disappeared. It lingered directly under the cab like a sentinel waiting. I kept my hand raised for a second too long, and the shadow shifted slightly in the opposite direction, a motion deliberate enough to confirm my worst fears. The gesture, which I had intended to be innocuous, became a catalyst for something that felt intelligent, reactive, patient, and far older than the rig itself. I dropped my hand slowly, trying to appear casual, and told myself that the instinct to communicate was stronger than reason. I replayed the moment in my head, imagining that maybe it had been coincidence. Maybe the shadow's movement had nothing to do with my signal. But every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I thought about the first 4 rules, how each built upon the other to enforce boundaries I hadn't even known existed before experiencing them firsthand. Every decision now, every twitch of muscle or eye, carried weight. The deckhand, oblivious to the silent drama under the cab, continued his tasks, occasionally glancing up at me. I tried to focus on his movements, as if doing so would anchor the moment in ordinary reality, but the water below seemed alive, stretching subtly toward the ladder he had climbed, tilting in response to our positions, shifting in ways that couldn't be explained by tides or reflections. I realized that attempting communication was not just risky, it was a violation of some unspoken primal agreement I had stumbled into without instruction. The rules weren't just warnings, they were invisible barriers between our world and the dark spaces that existed beneath. For the next several minutes, I remained frozen, unsure whether moving would provoke the shadow further, or if stillness was enough to appease it. I considered what might have happened if I'd signaled more forcefully or for longer, and the possibilities chilled me. The crane, though stationary, felt like a precarious lever above a living abyss. I had imagined that a small gesture could mitigate fear, could serve as a practical warning, but the reality was that even subtle actions were amplified in the presence of whatever existed in the water. My hands rested lightly on the controls, careful not to disturb anything, as if the difference between subtlety and catastrophe was measured in millimeters. I tried to reason it out logically, reminding myself that this is a job built on precise movements and careful communication. Yet logic was failing me. The shadow's presence directly beneath the cab wasn't subject to reason. It responded to intent, to motion, to thought, in ways that blurred the lines between reality and imagination. I realized that Rule 5 existed not to punish curiosity or concern, but to enforce a boundary between human action and something else, something patient and observant. Violating it was not just unsafe, it was provocative. My mind flicked to the consequences I'd observed in the past night shifts, equipment behaving subtly differently, unexplainable vibrations, moments where crew members hesitated, unsure whether instinct or reality was guiding them. I couldn't help but wonder if those events were tied to subtle breaches of this rule, tiny gestures that went unnoticed but nonetheless registered below. Each infraction, I imagined, left an impression, a trace that the shadows remembered, and those memories accumulated like sediment in the deep. I lowered my gaze to the controls, fingers brushing the joysticks, reassuring myself that my movements were deliberate, limited, and above all compliant. The shadow seemed to relax, retracting slightly, as if it had acknowledged my restraint. Even so, the air in the cab was thick with tension, heavy with the knowledge that my decision to signal, even momentarily, had consequences I didn't yet understand. The deckhand continued his work, still unaware, still innocent, but the shadow below knew. and that knowledge lingered like a stain. Time passed slowly, measured only by the rhythm of the crane's cable dripping water back into the sea. I stayed in the cab, hands resting lightly, waiting for what felt like approval, or at least a signal that it had no intention of reacting further. The experience altered how I viewed motion and visibility from that height. Every lift, every adjustment, every minor signal, even one intended for safety, was now a calculated risk, and every risk had the potential to awaken something below that was patient enough to wait for mistakes. By the end of the shift, I refused to signal or even look toward the deck, without a clear structural buffer between me and the shadows beneath. I kept the crane light off, my hands steady, my movements minimal, each motion deliberate, precise and controlled. I understood now that Rule 5 wasn't arbitrary or abstract. It was a safeguard against awakening awareness, against provoking observation in something that didn't operate by human logic. That night, I went to sleep in my bunk with a heightened vigilance, a new understanding that even small gestures could carry immense weight, and that patience and restraint were as vital as technical skill in surviving out here. I learned Rule 6. Never rely on the safety railings alone to protect you from what lurks beneath. The hard way, though. At the time, I didn't even know it was a rule. I had leaned casually against the edge of the platform, the railing cool under my palms, telling myself it was enough to keep me safe. The ocean beneath was calm, a muted gray, and the shadows that clung to the structure seemed nothing more than extensions of steel. My brain argued with my instinct, whispering that nothing could possibly emerge from the deep to reach me through a meter of metal. I closed my eyes briefly and exhaled, trying to shake the tension in my shoulders, believing the railing was my guarantee. The wind was mild, carrying the scent of salt and oil in the same thick metallic blend, and I convinced myself that every sway of the platform was ordinary, nothing abnormal. My eyes drifted to the shadows beneath, tracing them carefully as if inspecting a diagram I'd memorized. I told myself the shapes were consistent, following the lines of pylons and cables, anchored in predictable positions. But something in the patterns felt off, like someone had rearranged pieces of a puzzle to make it seem correct while hiding an entirely new configuration beneath. I realized then how fragile my sense of safety had been, how much I had relied on steel to mediate my vulnerability. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to see the shadow beneath from a better angle, and felt the subtle give of the railing. My heart skipped a beat, not because the metal was failing, but because it reminded me of the barrier's limitations. The railing couldn't prevent observation, couldn't enforce the rules, couldn't stop something from tracking movement from below. I felt foolish for ever believing it could, for ever treating it as more than a psychological boundary between myself and the darkness. Safety here was an illusion, one I had taken too lightly. Below the platform, the shadows stretched in ways that mocked my assumptions. They didn't move dramatically, but elongated subtly, like a pulse responding to my hesitation. I realized that the railing offered only a fraction of protection, a line drawn physically but not metaphysically. The shadow's extension seemed to test the boundary, brushing against the edge of my perception, probing how close it could come without crossing the line. Every instinct told me to step back, to retreat to the cab where compliance with the earlier rules provided at least a semblance of control. I stepped away from the railing, still gripping the platform edges, and tried to refocus on routine tasks. My hands were clammy despite gloves, and the rhythmic dripping from the crane cable became an anchor in the storm of thought. I thought about how long I had trusted safety rails before this, leaning, gesturing, reaching for tools with complete confidence. Each memory now seemed naive, almost dangerous in retrospect. I realized how easily reliance on a simple barrier could lull you into false security, making small movements seem harmless when they were not. Minutes passed, each measured by the gentle sway of the platform and the intermittent call from the radio. The shadow beneath adjusted, curling along the edges of the steel supports, but never separating fully. It seemed aware of my distance from the edge, of my compliance, of my movement, calculating, patient. I understood then that the railing was irrelevant to its intent. It existed to trick me into complacency. The lesson sank in slowly, heavy in my chest, until every fiber of my body understood that nothing physical could provide real protection in this environment. I thought about past incidents, shifts where minor adjustments and gestures had gone unrecorded, unnoticed, yet felt profound in hindsight. Each small oversight, each trust in metal and routine, now seemed like a negotiation with forces I could barely comprehend. I realized that the railing, the cab, even the crane itself were temporary measures, and survival relied on awareness and adherence to rules rather than material barriers. My attention sharpened, every shadow beneath the platform scrutinized, every movement considered. A low fog rolled in off the sea, thickening the shadows beneath and muting sound. The effect was subtle but disorienting, and I found myself leaning farther from the railing than I thought necessary, gripping tools and edges instinctively. The shadow's form shifted again, not approaching directly, but stretching across the supports, probing subtly. I felt exposed, aware of my own vulnerability, and I realized the railing had never been protection. It was a comfort I had mistaken for security. I remained vigilant, moving carefully and minimizing unnecessary actions. The crane cable's steady drip and the occasional faint creak of the rig became markers in my mental map, a way to measure normalcy against anomaly. Every glance beneath the cab was cautious, deliberate, aware that the shadow could react to me even when I tried to appear indifferent. My hands never left the controls entirely, though the crane remained still, a tangible connection to the rules and my own survival. Even as the shift drew to a close, I continued avoiding the railing, stepping only where my feet could be fully supported by solid steel. The shadows had returned to a deceptively static state, but I knew the stillness was temporary. I understood now that every breach of perceived safety was an invitation, a subtle way to draw attention from whatever lived beneath the platform. By the time I climbed down at the end of my shift, the lesson was ingrained. Steel can hold weight, cables can carry loads, but neither can shield you from the awareness waiting below. The day ended quietly, the rig humming its constant mechanical rhythm, yet the awareness lingered, the understanding that rules weren't arbitrary, and that reliance on physical barriers alone was a fatal error. My mind replayed the moments I had leaned, reached, and misjudged my own vulnerability. Each memory a reminder that vigilance was the true measure of safety. I had learned it the hard way, and I knew that the shadows beneath were patient, waiting for others to make the same mistakes I had made. Survival demanded more than metal. It demanded discipline, observation, and respect for the unseen. I only realized Rule 7. Never assume communication devices are safe. When shadows are near, they can transmit more than sound. After a quiet moment on the crane, when I thought I'd finally caught my breath, the morning had been calm, the shadows behaving obediently beneath the platform, and I convinced myself that the danger was behind me. My radio sat idle beside me, just a tool I rarely thought about unless a call came through. I tapped it absent-mindedly, testing the battery, imagining it harmless, but the shadow, which had been still for hours, shifted subtly beneath the cab, and that tiny motion made my hands freeze mid-air. Something about its movement suggested awareness, a conscious tracking of the device itself. The cab felt unnervingly silent, though it wasn't truly quiet. The faint hum of machinery, the drip of water from the crane cable, and my own uneven breathing combined into a soundtrack of heightened tension. I lifted the radio slightly, testing its range, speaking a few words to the deck below. The response came delayed and casual, masking concern in ordinary tone. I smiled faintly, reassured, until I noticed the shadows stretching differently, edges darkening, twisting in ways that suggested recognition rather than reflection. I realized that in my attempt to communicate, I had invited observation beyond what human senses could detect. At first, it seemed impossible. Radios transmit sound, maybe static, maybe signals, but they can't interact with shadows. My rational mind argued with instinct, insisting the timing was coincidence. But then I heard something subtle through the speaker, a whisper, not from the deckhand, but threaded into the static. The cadence matched no human speech, I knew, and the words weren't clear, yet the intent was unmistakable. It was aware responding. My stomach tightened as I set the radio down, realizing that the device had become a conduit, a bridge to whatever existed beneath the platform. I told myself to remain calm and to test the phenomenon scientifically, carefully, like a responsible operator observing anomalies. I keyed the mic again, this time speaking only neutral phrases about load position, wind speed, crane angle. The shadow shifted subtly with each transmission, moving independently of steel, independently of light, as if measuring tone, intent, or curiosity. Every instinct screamed to stop, but the operator in me wanted data. That desire was dangerous. That curiosity was reckless. Minutes stretched, each second amplified by the subtle reactions beneath me. I realized then how naive I had been in assuming the radio was a simple tool. The shadows didn't just mirror movement. They responded to signals, to intention, to communication, even when mediated through metal and circuitry. My awareness sharpened, every movement, every word, every breath, calculated for minimal disruption. I understood, viscerally, that the shadows beneath the cab were intelligent in ways that defied physical laws as I knew them. I tried leaving the radio off for a moment, watching, holding my breath. The shadow remained, shifting only when I adjusted my position or tilted the crane. The absence of sound did not equal absence of interaction. I realized that mere presence of a signaling device could be enough to elicit a response, that the rules about communication weren't arbitrary. They existed to protect operators from unknowable consequences, from subtle manipulations of environment and perception. I understood that the crane cab, the steel, even the water were secondary. The real danger was awareness itself. My attention flicked constantly between the shadow and the deck. Every crew member's movement felt magnified, as if they were unknowingly participating in a silent dialogue between me and the dark beneath. I felt trapped, not by walls or by cables, but by the knowledge that my attempts to communicate, even innocently, could provoke reactions I didn't understand. Even now, the shadows were patient, calculating, responding to devices designed for human convenience. I understood that the rules were a framework for interacting safely, a protocol to avoid the mistakes I was teetering on the edge of making. As the shift progressed, I kept the radio at my side, but unused, focusing on physical operation rather than verbal communication. Each time the shadows shifted, I reminded myself of Rule 7, understanding it now, not as instruction, but as survival guidance. I realized the cumulative weight of the previous rules was forming a mental architecture, boundaries, measures, safeguards, each reinforcing the other. The crane became more than machinery. It was a focal point for observation, a bridge between my world and something that watched from below. Even when the deck-handed calls came, I deferred to visual signals or brief, monotone instructions, keeping verbal communication minimal. The shadows remained subdued, but attentive, as if aware that restraint now signaled compliance. My hands never left the controls for long, my eyes tracing every edge, every ripple in the water beneath. By the end of the shift, exhaustion pressed into me physically and mentally, a reminder that vigilance is relentless, and that the simplest tool, here, a communication device, can carry unforeseen danger when the rules are ignored. By nightfall, I knew that Rule 7 was one of the most critical for survival. The radio, harmless as it seemed, could transmit signals beyond human comprehension, eliciting reactions that were subtle yet profound. I had learned that the shadows beneath the cab were aware, responsive, and capable of interpreting intention. Even when inactive, they waited, patient, observant, ensuring that compliance with the rules wasn't just optional. That understanding settled into me like a stone in the chest, heavy and immovable, a reminder that no tool is neutral, no action without consequence, and that adherence to the rules was not about convenience, it was about survival. I didn't grasp the full weight of Rule 8. Never let yourself be distracted by voices or movements on the platform when the shadows below seem unusually still. Until the day I almost ignored it, thinking the clatter of tools and conversation above was enough to ground me in reality. At first, the rig seemed like any other morning shift. The deck busy, crew members shouting coordinates and positions, the smell of oil and seawater hanging heavy in the air. I leaned against the crane cab controls, scanning the shadows below, and convinced myself that they were as inert as the equipment, that nothing could emerge while the human noise dominated. It was a comforting lie, one I nearly believed entirely. The first clue that something was wrong came as a pause, a strange, unnatural stillness beneath the cab that contrasted sharply with the bustling platform. The shadows didn't twitch, sway, or bend to mimic steel structures. They simply held their shape in a way that defied both water movement and gravity, a frozen waiting that made the hairs on my neck prickle. My eyes flicked nervously between the shadows and the crew above, and in that instant, I realized how dangerously my attention was divided. I had underestimated the importance of observation, distracted by ordinary sounds when the real threat required undivided focus. I tried to rationalize it, thinking perhaps it was the light, a reflection, or an alignment of perspective that made the shadows seem stationary. Yet every instinct told me that stillness was deliberate, not accidental. I felt a tightening in my chest, a low hum of dread that I couldn't shake. My hands gripped the crane controls with more tension than necessary, as if physical pressure could anchor me to reality. The voices above became background noise, irrelevant, while my mind fixated on the unnatural immobility beneath. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the water, the shadow shapes caught in a momentary lull, but moments stretched unnaturally long. Each passing second reinforced a sense of foreboding. Now I understood that Rule 8 wasn't just about observation. It was about disciplined focus and resisting the illusions of normalcy that could make you look up at ordinary activity and ignore the extraordinary just beneath. A deckhand waved from the platform, calling out a question about cable tension. Normally, I would have responded instantly, hands moving to adjust or check readings. This time, I hesitated, keeping my gaze locked on the shadow directly below the cab. The stillness there was almost tactile, pressing against my awareness, and I felt my pulse spike with every passing second. The wave from the deckhand felt distant, absurdly irrelevant, as if he existed in a different world. I realized that this was precisely what the rule warned against. Distraction could cost you more than time. It could cost you life. Minutes crawled by in a mixture of silence and partial awareness. The shadows remained rigid, but the sense of them watching intensified, responding to the slightest twitch of my eye or tilt of my head. My body tensed, knuckles whitening on the controls, every instinct screaming to focus entirely on the dark forms beneath. I understood, more fully than ever, that vigilance was not optional. Ordinary tasks, normal interactions, casual gestures, they could all be misinterpreted by whatever resided in those shadows, each mistake amplified by the rules I was only now learning to obey. I reminded myself of previous incidents, of times when small mistakes had gone unnoticed, only to manifest consequences later. The rule didn't just exist to prevent observation errors, it existed to prevent provocation, to keep operators from inadvertently interacting with forces beyond comprehension. I realized the shadows were patient, deliberate, and reactive, waiting for signs of divided attention to exploit. Even the mundane activities on the deck could have unintended repercussions if my focus strayed. For the rest of the shift, I kept my eyes locked on the shadows beneath the cab, letting nothing distract me, not the clatter of tools, not the shouts from above, not the occasional laugh of a crew member passing by. My attention became an anchor, tethering me to safety through discipline alone. Every subtle movement in the water, every irregularity and shadow shape, drew my full observation. I realized that the rule demanded more than awareness, it demanded complete immersion in the present, a vigilance that was exhausting, almost suffocating, but undeniably necessary. By evening, I was mentally drained, my body moving on autopilot while my mind remained alert to the slightest anomaly below. The shadows remained mostly still, but I sensed their awareness, a quiet tension that was palpably alive. Even as I climbed down from the crane at the end of the shift, the lesson persisted. Distractions could be deadly, even when the world above seemed ordinary and benign. The platform's noise, once comforting, now felt like a test, a persistent reminder that Rule 8 existed because failure to focus had consequences I might never fully understand. The shadows had taught me restraint, patience, and the importance of undivided attention. Ordinary actions were no longer benign. They had weight, significance, and risk. Every glance, every gesture, every breath could invite consequence if I wasn't careful. I understood then that survival was about observation and discipline above all else, and that distraction, even from those I trusted most, could bring the unseen into motion. The shadows waited, patient and precise, and I knew that breaking my focus even once could undo everything I had learned. I first realized Rule 9. Never assume the depth of the water or shadows beneath is constant. It can shift without warning. During a mid-shift inspection, thinking I had finally understood the rhythm of the shadows and the safety of the water below, I leaned over the railing, peering down at the dark expanse beneath the platform, and convinced myself that the shapes I saw were fixed, anchored to the steel or the structure of the rig. But as I watched, a subtle movement made the water appear deeper in some places, and shallower in others, like the sea itself was breathing. My stomach clenched as the realization hit. Nothing was reliable here, not even what seemed obvious or permanent. I gripped the cab controls tighter, trying to steady my breathing while simultaneously trying to map the subtle distortions beneath me. Each shadow that had once seemed predictable now shifted minutely, stretching or compressing in ways that suggested intelligence and malleability. My mind raced to explain it away, currents, reflections, tidal anomalies, but the instinctive fear crawling up my spine told me none of these explanations were adequate. I had underestimated how mutable the environment could be, and that mistake felt heavier than any mechanical error I had ever made. The crane's shadowed reflection flickered across the water, highlighting changes I hadn't noticed before. The platform appeared stable, yet the shadows beneath seemed to move independently of physical structures, sliding along lines that didn't exist, curving in impossible ways. I realized that any assumptions I made about depth, weight, or positioning could be wrong in a heartbeat. A misjudgment, even one rooted in logic or experience, could be catastrophic if I relied on a false perception of stability. Each shadow became an uncertain variable, and I was suddenly hyper-aware that nothing could be taken for granted. As I moved the crane slightly to adjust a cable, the shadow beneath reacted not in sync with steel, but in anticipation of my actions, compressing or stretching just before the boom moved. The water appeared deeper beneath the crane leg, shallower beneath the deck's support, distortions that couldn't exist under normal physics. My pulse raced as I realized that Rule 9 was as much about mindset as observation. Survival depended on expecting instability, on never assuming anything about what lay below, and on preparing for the unexpected at every turn. I thought about previous shifts when I had leaned over the railing or adjusted equipment without a second thought, assuming the shadows were fixed, predictable. Each instance now seemed reckless. The illusion of consistency had lulled me into overconfidence, and I understood that the water itself could no longer be trusted as a reference point. The platform might appear solid, the crane might feel steady, yet the true measure of risk lay in the mutable fluid forms beneath, shifting with intent I could barely comprehend. Every time I glanced down, the depth seemed to change subtly, as though the shadows were sliding along invisible contours or warping the water itself. I caught the reflection of the crane in the surface, noticing how distorted it appeared in certain spots. It was subtle, easy to miss, but unmistakable once noticed. That distortion was a warning, a tactile reminder that assumptions were dangerous, and that my understanding of space and structure was insufficient when confronted with the rules of this rig and the shadows it harbored. I adjusted my position in the cab, taking care not to tip the crane boom too far, every motion deliberate, measured, restrained. The water below responded to each movement in ways that defied explanation. A gentle swelling, a slight contraction, a shift in tone and depth that I could feel rather than see. It was disorienting, a test of both perception and instinct. I realized that Rule 9 demanded more than caution. It required constant recalibration of senses, an almost obsessive awareness of how everything beneath the cab could shift in ways I might not predict. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, my focus stretched thin from tracking the mutable depths and the restless shadows. The cab felt simultaneously secure and precarious, a paradoxical combination that left me tense and alert. Each shift in shadow or water depth became a mental challenge, forcing me to weigh every movement, every lift, every adjustment with the understanding that the world below was not fixed. I began to map the patterns in my mind, though I knew instinctively that the shadows could and would change without warning, making every map temporary and every observation provisional. Even as I performed routine tasks, the water's shifting depth made simple actions feel risky. I realized that Rule 9 wasn't just about observation, it was about humility, about acknowledging that human perception is fallible when confronted with phenomena outside our comprehension. I approached each movement with care, testing, observing, adjusting. The shadows, patient and aware, watched every hesitation, every twitch of a lever, learning, waiting, shifting in response to my presence. By the end of my shift, I understood fully why the rule existed. Assuming stability was the quickest route to disaster, I descended from the cab slowly, hands gripping steel supports, aware that the water beneath could seem shallow one moment and impossibly deep the next. The lesson was ingrained, heavy in my chest, a reminder that survival on the rig depended not just on skill or training, but on perpetual vigilance and respect for the ever-shifting world below. The shadows had taught me once again that nothing was predictable, and that the rules were the only anchors I had in a place that defied certainty. I learned Rule 10. Never underestimate the effect of isolation on your perception. The shadows will exploit it. During a stretch of night shifts when the platform felt impossibly large and empty, and the hum of machinery became a lullaby for unease, the other crew members had rotated off hours earlier, leaving me alone in the crane cab. The only sounds my own breath, and the occasional drip from the crane cable. At first, I told myself solitude was just part of the job, a time for focus and efficiency. But as the night deepened, the shadows beneath the cab seemed to stretch longer, thinner, almost sentient, reacting to my presence and my absence simultaneously. At first, I blamed fatigue, imagining the shadows shifting because I was tired or my eyes were adjusting. But the movement wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, and responsive to my own attention. I caught myself questioning whether what I was seeing was real, whether the isolation had warped my mind, or whether the shadows had always behaved this way, and I was only now noticing. That uncertainty gnawed at me, a quiet, persistent panic that demanded focus yet resisted comprehension. I realized that the true danger wasn't just the shadows themselves. It was how they manipulated the senses, exploiting my solitude to create doubt and fear. Hours passed in a rhythm I couldn't measure. The shadows remained just beyond the edge of clarity, stretching across the water and supports, shifting subtly in response to my slightest glance or movement. The silence of the empty platform amplified every perception. A creak of steel became a footstep, a ripple in the water, a presence watching, judging. I caught myself whispering to break the quiet, to reassure myself that someone else existed in the world. Even then, I felt a prickling awareness that the shadows were listening, not just with eyes, but through something deeper, something I couldn't name. My movements became tentative. I found myself double-checking every control, every cable alignment, as if the shadows beneath could punish error instantly. At one point, I thought I saw a shape lift from beneath the cab, a mass of darkness that mirrored the platform's geometry, but did so in ways impossible under natural law. My first instinct was disbelief, to rationalize it as trickery of light and water. Then I remembered Rule 10. and I understood that disbelief itself was part of the trap. Isolation was a tool, a way to make me question what was real, to make my attention unreliable. I tried to stay busy, focusing on crane adjustments and inspections that should have been mundane. Yet even routine tasks became exercises in hyper-awareness, every glance at the water below a test of will and perception. The shadows reacted subtly to my gaze, moving in patterns that suggested recognition. I realized that being alone didn't just amplify fear, it magnified the consequences of every hesitation and decision. My own mind, stretched by solitude, became a liability, creating opportunities for mistakes that the shadows could exploit without effort. At one point, I attempted to call the deck for a routine check, but hesitated mid-sentence, realizing that Rule 10 warned against assuming isolation affected only the operator. The shadows could sense my attention, my intent, and perhaps even my voice, regardless of whether anyone else was near. The moment I paused, I felt their presence intensify, as if they were observing the fracture in my certainty, waiting for the next lapse. My hands shook slightly on the controls, not from cold or fatigue, but from the awareness that every action now had amplified consequences. I found myself questioning the passage of time. Hours blended into each other, and I began measuring shifts not by the sun or mechanical cycles, but by the behavior of the shadows. Each subtle twist, curl, or elongation became a marker in my internal clock. The crane cab, once a place of control, now felt like a cell where isolation distorted both perception and reality. I realized fully that Rule 10 existed not just to protect operators from shadows, but from themselves, their own senses, their own senses, their own assumptions, their own fragile confidence. By the end of the shift, exhaustion had dulled my reflexes, but sharpened my awareness of the shadow's patience. The rig hummed its usual mechanical rhythm, but I understood that the true rhythm was dictated by the interplay between isolation and perception, and that any lapse could be exploited. I climbed down from the cab slowly, muscles tight, mind alert, acutely aware of how the shadows had used my solitude to assert dominance over perception. That night, as I lay in my bunk, I understood a new level of respect and fear. Solitude was no longer simple emptiness. It was a tool, a conduit through which the unseen exerted influence, a reminder that the rules existed to protect the mind as much as the body. Isolation had become tangible, a weight pressing on my chest, and I realized that nothing on the rig could fully shield me from the psychological manipulation that came with it. Every shadow, every ripple in the water, every flicker of light became a signal I had to interpret carefully. The lesson of Rule 10 was clear and terrifying. Survival required not just adherence to mechanical rules, but mastery over one's own mind, because the shadows were patient enough to exploit any weakness, any distraction, any lapse born of solitude. I understood Rule 11. Never ignore the instinct that something is watching. Even when everything seems calm, the last rule is the one nobody survives. On a night when silence had fallen heavier than usual across the rig, the platform lights were dimmed for maintenance, and the water beneath the cab lay flat, an oily mirror-like surface reflecting nothing but darkness. At first I told myself it was just fatigue, that the tension of weeks alone in the crane cab was playing tricks on me. But then I felt it, a presence patient and knowing, like the water itself, had grown eyes, and had decided to watch me, carefully cataloging every movement, every hesitation, every thought that crossed my mind. I gripped the controls as if they were the only tether keeping me from drifting into some unmeasured abyss. The shadows beneath had been subtle before, reacting to motion, to sound, to signals, but now they were quiet, impossibly still, and in their stillness was a weight that pressed into my awareness. I remembered the other 10 rules in fragmented bursts: locks, hatches, radios, isolation, shifting depths. Each of them had built toward this moment, preparing me in ways I hadn't fully realized. I understood now that all the vigilance, all the adherence, was leading to a confrontation with instinct itself, the one thing no rule could fully regulate. The crane cab felt claustrophobic, though I had spent countless nights here and thought I knew every inch of it. Every shadow seemed amplified. Every vibration in the metal echoed like a whisper. I felt the subtle sway of the rig, as if it were breathing, aware of me in a way no human could be. The calmness around me, the absence of ordinary noise, wasn't peace. It was a trap. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just currents, just wind, just imagination, but the gnawing certainty in my chest refused to be quelled. I scanned the platform, noting every detail, the deckhands long gone, the ladders glinting faintly in the muted light, the cables taut but still. Nothing appeared out of place, yet every instinct screamed otherwise. My eyes flicked constantly to the water beneath, where shadows clung to the pylons, stretched across gaps, and bent in impossible ways. For a fleeting moment, I imagined the shadows as normal, predictable, manageable, but the instinct I'd suppressed since the beginning whispered louder than reason. Something was watching, and it knew I had noticed. I tried to move, to reach for a hatch or adjust the crane, but my hands hesitated. The water below seemed to pulse, shifting subtly without ripple, reacting to my indecision. It was patient, infinitely patient, and I realized that ignoring instinct here was not an option. The first 10 rules had been preparation, guiding me to recognize boundaries, to respect limits, to measure every action. But Rule 11 demanded surrender to awareness, an acknowledgement that the rules could protect against behavior, but not against perception itself. The shadows didn't need to strike. They only needed me to realize I was being observed. Minutes felt like hours as I sat frozen, monitoring every subtle distortion beneath the cab. The shadows were immobile, yet alive in ways I could feel more than see. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, every breath deliberate, every thought careful not to invite attention. I realized that compliance with the rules had delayed consequences, but instinct could not be delayed. It demanded acknowledgement, respect, and fear. I understood that the last rule existed because everything else could fail silently, and in the end, recognition of presence, of observation, was unavoidable. I considered breaking the routine, climbing down for a moment to check cables or inspect the platform. Every instinct screamed against it. The shadows, patient and precise, would register the slightest movement, the slightest miscalculation. I understood finally that the last rule was not just about survival, it was about humility, about recognizing limits of perception, about respecting forces beyond comprehension. I had obeyed the other rules, but Rule 11 demanded something different: attention, presence, and submission to the awareness that I was no longer the observer, but the observed. Even as the shift ended, I remained in the cab, motionless, the shadows beneath still, the water flat and dark. I could feel them, patient and unrelenting, knowing my every microsecond of hesitation. I understood with a clarity that burned, that this rule was absolute. It didn't matter how careful you were, how diligent, or how precise. Ignoring instinct was a fatal error, the one misstep that could unravel everything, that could allow observation to become interaction in ways I couldn't anticipate. I took a shallow breath, keeping my eyes locked on the water, acknowledging without challenge that I was watched. The rig hummed, machinery moving mechanically around me, but I felt nothing mechanical here, only presence, only observation, only patient anticipation. I realized the rules were guides, protections, lessons, but Rule 11 was truth. The shadows were patient, eternal, and I had no choice but to respect them. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.